fill their world? Hello, happy Monday. I'm not even sure if the ad break is over. Usually try to give people enough time to get here. So, thanks, Joed. Uh, Happy Monday. You know, we hate to beat this horse dead, but it is March 23rd. Every time I look at the calendar, I'm like that emoji with the exploding head, right? How in how loud is my sound, Druid? Is it like can you keep it on a low volume and still hear me? I feel like I'm like blowing out my equalizer. So, um anyway, every time I change settings, I streamed this weekend from my mother's house, so who knows. Okay, just right. Okay, cool. So, yeah. How do we get to the end of the month? I don't know. I know I saw some of you this weekend. We did Stitch and Glitch with quilt nerding, and we just had a fun and ridiculous time as we usually do. And I was at my mom's this weekend because she did a lecture for the Baltimore Applique Society. And she has never done a lecture via Zoom, so she was very nervous. And she said, "I can't do this lecture unless you come and like sit right beside me." So I was like, of course I'll come. So I helped her with the tech aspect of it. The topic of her talk was about writing on quilts, and her focus was about writing on your own quilts, or if you want to document, say, a family quilt or a quilt that you purchased that you have provenance about, that this idea of using your own handwriting to document. Lots of people, either with their own quilts or with family quilts, will maybe write a narrative and put that fabric that goes through the printer, and if you have an inkjet printer, that it's not super archival. Like it can easily fade in sunlight, and probably even in like regular fluorescent light. So anyway, her thought process in this, and long before all of the modern products even came out, she was teaching this class. I think the very first time she taught it was in 1991. And so she kind of wanted to get back into it. And so anyway, working with her and putting together a new PowerPoint, because when she was teaching it before, she didn't have a PowerPoint. So, kind of helping her get, her 1991 content into a 2026 format. She taught me a lot of stuff. And, I thought it was kind of funny because you guys know I write on my quilts. I think you've seen enough of my quilts to know that a number of them have very exaggerated handwriting on them. And of course I learned how to do that from her. The techniques I use come from that class she taught when I was a kid. When I was I was like my senior year in high school. In fact, I want to say teaching that class several times my senior year in high school, along with some other stuff, I think is what paid for my graduation dress. So I owe a lot to the concept of writing on quilts, I guess. So anyway, long story, she, even though her focus was like literally like picking up the archival pens and how to do it yourself, I gave her some images that I had, about writing on quilts, about signatures on quilts, and just to kind of give the historical context. And the best pictures I have that I could share, because I do have pictures of people's signature quilts, but they've come out of quilt studies. And most people in quilt studies are a little bit like, please don't use, my images for anything that's not personal. So, I just, she and I didn't necessarily have the time to pour through all of my pictures and contact people, because it wasn't the focus of her talk anyway. So I was like, showed these examples from a museum exhibit that I saw. I took the pictures. You could add, attribute them to the museum and to me because I took those pictures. Anyway, it was the Wild and Untamed exhibit at the Maryland Center for History and Culture. You guys have seen it because I've shown it before. And, I think I've showed you guys the pictures just here, from a quilt study perspective, but I think, a number of you probably also saw my Dr. Dunton lecture. I made it available for a very short period of time a couple years ago, and I know several of you watched it. So again, this is nothing new to you. But, and going through this folder I was like, wow, this is a show I can't go back to, right? It was, a moment in time, basically. They kind of had two versions of it because it was right smack dab in the middle of the pandemic. They had to postpone it for a bit because of the pandemic. And then once it went up, they had one version of it up for quite some time, maybe 6 months, it was up for quite some time. And then they rehung more quilts. So there were two versions of it. I saw the second version of it. I wasn't able to get to the first version of it. Pandemic, right? It was really hard to get out and see stuff. So, and just looking at my pictures, I'm like, wow, the things I didn't know. So I thought it would be fun to revisit that. And the method to my madness at that time was much different than it is today when I go to an exhibit and or attend a quilt study, what I'm looking at, what I'm looking for. Like I said, I can't necessarily go back on any of this, but some of these quilts are, they're local. I think almost all of these quilts were from the Maryland Center for History and Culture. So it's not like they've gone somewhere and I'll never see them again. And I think there possibly were some from, I know that there was some stuff from the Baltimore Museum of Art as well. So, it's not, I could in theory kind of recreate the show with better images, from their archives. It's been a while since I've been into the Maryland Center for History and Culture archives, like their online stuff. I can't remember how detailed their stuff is, but I know the Baltimore Museum of Art certainly has, a decent archive. Anyway, long story short, what I'm trying to say here is, boy, I have learned some things. So I think it'd be kind of funny to just sort of look at baby researcher cake a couple years ago versus, what I'm looking for today. And, that we do that. And it's really funny where we left off in American Quilts by Elizabeth Wells Robertson. We were in section 4, in this very last section. I glanced at it today because I'm like, all right, how much time am I going to have to look at Wild and Tamed? I don't think I'll probably skip through some details. But I was like, yeah, how much do we have to read? And it's really only 2 pages left in this section, but it's about album and autograph quilts. So I'm like, well, Stephanie, this is serendipity. This is a sign that I must look at Wild and Untamed and kind of sort of in the tail end of the energy of my mom's talk. So that is what we are doing today. And at the very least, even if I don't get any more reading done today in American Quilts, I want to read that section. It's just like, it's not even 2 full pages. It's like a page and 2/3. So that's the plan. All right, so let me just pull this up. And like I said, I'm going to whip through some of it. There's a couple things, of course, I'll mention. You guys know I found some inaccuracies in both. Well, it's a guess as far as the inaccuracy. I'd have to talk to a curator to really know for sure, or the archivist. But I did correct some things with my research. So I'll mention those too. Just because, it's kind of makes me feel good about myself when I can correct an inaccuracy. All right, let me get my screens to work out. Okay. Okay, here we go. So this is the Maryland Center for History and Culture. I don't know in terms of the history of the building that they're in. I don't know what it used to be. I don't know if they built it from scratch or not. I They're the Maryland Historical Society is what they are. But they have an incredible library, and it's a huge building, and the shows that they mount are fantastic. They're all Maryland based. Like they were the ones that had the Jim Henson exhibit with all of the cool Muppet and Sesame Street and Dark Crystal, all that stuff, because Jim Henson was a Maryland native. Claire McCardle, the fashion designer, she also Maryland native. So it's pretty cool. If there's somebody famous out of Maryland and they can mount an exhibit on it, they will. And it's, so awesome. Their civil rights exhibit, from Maryland and DC, from the all of this cool stuff from the 60s, and just so fascinating. And I think they were juxtaposing it between, the state of our country throughout the pandemic to today versus, what it was like in the 60s and, in this place and time, right? Maryland. So I think it's very cool that they mounted this exhibit, and they kept it up for a very long time. So anyway, you can see this big, beautiful marble wall, in kind of this open area here where you come in. It's a beautiful space. And so Wild and Untamed, if you're not aware, is the name that Dr. Dunton, and this is William Rush Dunton, Baltimore psychiatrist. He was originally from Pennsylvania. He was doing his work in the early 20th century. And quilts, he thought, would be a good, occupational therapy for his patients, and the rest is history. He fell in love with quilts. Wild and Untamed refers to the Baltimore applique quilt, or Baltimore applique quilts, or Baltimore album quilts, sorry. The Baltimore album quilts, they are applique heavy. He loved that. Pieced quilts did not excite him as much. He did write a manuscript for pieced quilts or patchwork quilts. Never published it because his first book didn't go so well. I won't get into those details, but if you know, you know. And they touch on the book here. But anyway, this is the entrance. I thought this was cool, and ordinarily you get these exhibitions have been made possible, and it's usually through grants and endowments and all this kind of stuff. But what I have to make the point here is this exhibit was actually made possible in multiple ways by the Baltimore Applique Society and Mimi Dietrich. And it's really not it's really not a mistake that I'm wearing the Hometown Girl shirt today. It also happened to be on the top stack of my clean t-shirts. But Hometown Girl was an exhibit for Mimi Dietrich's quilts. If you're not familiar with Mimi Dietrich, she is a founder of the Baltimore Applique Society, but also a quilt teacher. She has she has many books. She's been teaching quilting techniques, applique and Baltimore album type techniques like since the 80s, I think. So she and her husband are very involved here in Maryland with some Maryland important Maryland stuff, I guess. So the Maryland Historical Society, of course, they are also alumni of the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, which is also where I got my master's. So, they're just very involved, and they're not, they don't represent this, giant wealthy person foundation. They represent like the good people of Baltimore. So I thought that I wanted to point this out. Additionally, the Baltimore Applique Society is the reason why Dr. Dunton's collection, which is housed at the Baltimore Museum of Art, they are the reason why it has been indexed and put into archival shape. Before they got involved, from what I understand, it was like a big stack of crap in the like some closet at the museum. And they raised the money. It was back in the 90s for the librarian archivist to, buy the archival boxes that all of his scrapbooks and files would go in, and then to index it all so that future researchers could come in and find things. And so, that takes up a lot of time, and that stuff costs money. So they raise that money. And, they are a small and scrappy organization. And I have so much respect for them and what they do. So I just want to point that out. Okay. So Dr. William Rush Dunton Jr., I'm going to go ahead and read this to you. Dr. William Rush Dunton Jr., 1868 to 1960, is it 66? Yeah, 66, was known as the father of modern occupational therapy. He's one of 7 people. I suspect that those other 6 probably wouldn't be happy about only his name being associated with it, but he did write the book on it. He was also one of the first inductees into the Quilters Hall of Fame. Throughout his career, Dunton asserted that his interest in quilts stemmed from his quest to find a therapeutic treatment for his female patients who suffered from anxiety. He called them his nervous ladies. Despite this proclamation, it is evident that his passion for quilts extended far beyond their therapeutic application. Dunton traveled around Maryland, photographing, documenting, and collecting quilts. He had a small collection. He did not collect that many. I want to say it was like 10 or 12 at the most. And in 1946 to 47, he self-published his book, Old Quilts, in which he minutely detailed the designs and history of hundreds of quilts. This is why the book did not do well, because of that minute description. Because, the pictures are in black and white. They're not superb. It was just the technology of the time. I think his work, if he was publishing today and he had access to what we have access to, I think he could have done a much better job and he would have been more appreciated. I mean, as he is today, even with what he did produce. Working in the early 20th century, Dunton likely felt societal pressure to attribute his interest in what was considered a feminine craft to his work in occupational therapy. His avid interest in quilts was matched by an equal interest in women's history. Studying the social history of quilting and the women who made quilts served Dunton as the basis for formalizing his occupational therapy treatments. So women's history... I'm not going to say that Dunton would have been like, women's history, what? I think that's an assumption. And it's an assumption I also make, but I have not found anything that specifically says he's out there like fighting the good fight for ladies. He never explicitly says that. But, by virtue of what he has done and what we know, I think we can safely say this, but no, it is an assumption because he never explicitly said, oh, I'm out here, women's history is so important. That's not necessarily where his head was at. Throughout this exhibition, excerpts from the works of Dr. William Rush Dunton Jr. provide insight into his thoughts and feelings. The importance of both his medical work and his interest in quilts is evident, and it is sometimes unclear which one prevailed. That is true. By the time he was at retirement age, he retired, then quickly attached himself to another sanitarium that was in need of supervision, worked there for like 12 years. He was like, I'm just filling in for a colleague. And he worked there for 12 years. But the whole time he's working, in his later years, he's serving as, this medical director of a sanitarium south of Baltimore. Pretty much all of his research work, you find all of his notes are on the backside of Laurel Sanitarium documents. So you kind of wonder, like, what was he up to? He's sitting in his office all day, like, working on quilts. He would take all of his quilt research with him when he would, infrequently come back to Baltimore and then go back to Laurel because he stayed there. He basically lived at the hospital. So yeah, it is a little bit like I feel like Dunton might have been one of those people who he probably was always destined to be a doctor, but I really and truly believe that had he been born much later and was with us today, that the trajectory of his retirement would have been so much different. So this is a quote from him. Safety first being good advice to follow. I always start my quilt talks with some explanation as to why a stout elderly gentleman, and this is what he called himself, has an interest in this form of stitchery, because naturally I do not want to be called a sissy. I became interested in quilt making as a form of occupational therapy for the nervous ladies under my care. And this was an excerpt from a lecture to the Maryland Historical Society. I haven't tracked this down yet. I don't know if I just have missed it in his collection. Like, if I feel like all of the notes I have that I've documented and looked at from his collection are all just like, again, like note cards. There's no specific like speech transcript. So I'm not really sure where this comes from. It's probably right in front of me. I probably have it somewhere. I've just overlooked it, but haven't really identified exactly where they got this quote. And so this picture, this was 1916 when he mounted a show of quilts, and it was surprising to him what happened. So this was like the big other placard in the middle of the first room. So I'll go ahead and read this as well. And there's also a quote from him. So Dunton's rediscovery of Baltimore album quilts. Of all the quilt styles, Dr. William Rush Dunton Jr. was particularly interested in the wild album quilts popular in Maryland from 1840 to 1855. It was just a very short window that these were made. These quilts were anything but tame. Not made for use as bed covers, they were works of art, often presented as gifts and displayed in the home of the recipient. Despite the prevalence of this quilt style in its time, it fell into obscurity until Dunton began his research a century later. Dunton traveled around the state, collecting Baltimore album quilts and recording family histories. Now, let's be clear, he did not collect the quilts. He borrowed quilts and he studied them. He documented them. Particularly in his later years, his youngest son was a photographer, and his son took pictures of the quilts. There's evidence of and documentation of Dunton donating quilts to the Maryland Center for History and Culture, but it was literally like, again, a handful of quilts. It was not a lot. Dunton did not collect. And I see this coming up over and over and over again. There were, they're saying it here. He was collecting quilts. He was not collecting them. He was documenting them. And even Antiques Magazine during his lifetime complained that his book was based on just the quilts he collected. Not true, because he didn't collect quilts. He was traveling, and of course his range was limited just by the time. I don't think he had a car. If he did, he rode the train a lot. So I don't think that he drove. I don't think he had a car. He was often not, he was often in some financial straits. I have some evidence of creditors that he wrote to. A couple were definitely in, when his first wife died, he wasn't paying his bills on time. So he was not a wealthy man, even though he was a doctor. Okay, where did I leave off? So the culmination of his research was Old Quilts, the first published history of the Baltimore applique quilt tradition, or Baltimore album quilt tradition. Throughout his in-depth study of the quilts, their makers, and the social culture surrounding the tradition, Dunton saw potential for his medical work. He thought the self-expression in design, the occupation of sewing and quilting, and the participation in a group project would all be beneficial to some of his female patients afflicted with depression and anxiety. And ultimately, it was color. His first focus was on color. And he thought that them just looking at a quilt pattern and, focusing on like, what colors would I use? And then kind of the next step would be like actually assembling some fabrics and et cetera to make the quilt. But his very first focus was really just on color. He had a very strong belief in color as being, from an art therapy standpoint, being therapeutic to work with color. Hey, Robin, by the way, I missed you this weekend. I know you said you were busy this weekend. You had something going on. You might not make it um, to Stitch and Glitch. And Jill pooped out early. Usually on Stitch and Glitch, we're usually pretty good for like 2.5, 3 hours. She was really pooped out, so we didn't do our full time. Okay, so this is a quote from the book. For the purposes of this study, quilts may be divided into two groups, the wild and the tame. The former may be said to be those in which the maker's fancy for design was untrammeled by convention, and she executed something varying from the beautiful to the grotesque, but usually original. He had some ideas, that's for sure. Okay. That was just another angle. Okay. If I had this to do all over again, I would have, so my strategy now when I go to a museum is to try and get like some, backed up, like wide angle kind of pictures, just so you can kind of get a sense of what the exhibit looked like. But this case was across from the main big Wild and Untamed sign. And so, you were looking at that sign, you turn around, and then there's this case on the corner of the entrance. And this had a whole bunch of, bits and pieces in here. And there is this sewing project being made. Well, I don't think that their information about this is accurate. So let me quickly read this to you, and then we'll look a little bit more. So this says, unfinished silk patchwork quilt. Anna Maria Gordon Gemmell Dunton. This is his mother. 1833 to 1893. And I think 1885 to 1889 is when she was, I think, documented. You could document that she was making, she was doing work like this. Anna Maria Annie Gordon Gemmell Dunton. And by the way, his father's sister was also named Anna Marie Gemmell Dunton. You can't make this stuff up. How? I don't know. His mother was from Delaware, like sort of the shore region of the East Coast, whereas his aunt, his father's sister, would have been from right outside of Philadelphia. So very strange. I mean, the distance isn't that far, but like, how did these two women, kind of close in age, did their families know each other? I don't know. I have not been able to get down to that kind of information, but both families were in the colonial families of America, meaning they were somewhat wealthy and had been in the country for a long time, but beyond that, I do not know how these two women, other than the fact that Anna or Maria or Annie, like those are very common names, right? But for this two women in his life to have identical names almost, it's pretty crazy, right? So anyway, they say she was a talented needleworker, an early pupil of the Philadelphia School of Art Embroidery and Dr. Dunton's mother. So the Philadelphia School, she was one of the inaugural students. And I think it was probably a situation where she was supportive of the institute, the school. And I don't know that she necessarily was there to learn, but rather to be supportive, because I think she had kind of a lifetime of sewing experience. And I think he was very close to her. He doesn't talk about his mother. I mean, it doesn't talk about his father. He talks about his mother. So I think they were very close. She instilled in her son an appreciation for the fiber arts at an early age. Dunton recalled attempting his own needlework projects and assisting his mother by cutting patterns and fabrics for quilts, such as the unfinished quilt constructed from an assortment of salvaged fabric scraps. His mother did not quilt. She did not make quilts. So this information is inaccurate. I think, based on my research and what I've read in Dunton's his own writings, unpublished, is that these are something he procured for the Maryland Historical Society. He was very connected with them during his lifetime. So, oh, Robin, it's okay. We just missed you. Life happens, we know. But I'm always glad to see any of you guys, when you can take the time out. Do you guys realize how flattered I am by that? And Jill too, when our friends have the time to hang out with us, we love that. And we understand when you don't. Um, so what Anna Maria, or Annie as she was known, she did Berlin work, which is a type of like needlepoint. It's uses wool yarn and a specific kind of canvas. And I've seen all of this in his collection, the documentation of it. So, but in his own writing, he talks about procuring for the Maryland Historical Society a strip and some pieces of unfinished silk patchwork. And that is this. He also mentions in his book about his mother's work, in that she didn't make quilts, and she certainly never made one of those horrible silk things called crazy quilts, which she hated crazy quilts. But she was doing like things like he described something that she was making from his old neckties, his childhood neckties. I mean, he was a privileged boy. Dunton, I mean, the colonial families of America, they were rich people in Philadelphia. But what he describes is his mother was making a tea box, or some kind of tea box thing. And what that told me, it was probably something like English paper piecing, is what I gathered. It could have been, just regular pieced, but I feel like something like a tea box. It might have been in like an inlay or a covering of some sort. It just does not square with what we see here. This sounds exactly like the description he had of this silk fragments that he gave to the, he acquired for the Maryland Historical Society. They're the Maryland Center for History and Culture today. You guys, unless you live in Maryland, you can't imagine how irritating it is to try and say their whole name when they're the Maryland Historical Society. Well, this is just another picture of it. So these were strips that were hanging on the wall above the plastic, it was like an acrylic case over, and like I said, I didn't get a great picture of it. I wish I had gotten backed up and taken a picture of the whole thing so you could see this better. But these were hanging on the wall above the case. And, again, while some of these, I can understand why a curator or, an archivist or whoever was working with this stuff might look at these things and go, oh yeah, those look like neckties, because they do. This does indeed look like silk fabric from a necktie, some of this. But to me, these are dress fabrics. These are silk dress fabrics of, late 19th century, mid to late 19th century. This is something he procured for them that, in his travels. That is my belief. And, I feel like I have the receipts to back that up. Here, you see my feet. Okay, this is it. I have in my possession an incomplete tea box piece made up of diamonds, so not strips, diamonds of some of my childhood neckties. They must have been made in the late 70s or the very early 80s, shortly before the revival of quilt making, which expressed its manufacture of those horrible silk things called crazy quilts. It is to my mother's credit that she never made one. So again, like this tea box piece, and it's made of diamonds. It's not what they're showing in here and attributing to her. So I think what little he had that belonged to his mother is in his collection. And those are her Berlin work charts, and possibly some of the fabric fragments, although that's kind of a stretch in my mind. Somebody could probably easily prove me wrong. Okay, so this, I think what has happened here is this is in pieces. This is a quilt that has, had sustained damage and is been conserved by attaching it to a backing, I think. I think that's what I'm looking at here. Unfortunately, again, I did not spend the time I wish I had, like, really looking at this. I took some pictures. So, you know what? Let me leave this up and I will read to you guys from my file. So you can just look at it while I read. Okay, so this, and hopefully these are in order, you guys. Again, I'm like, what, Stephanie, what is wrong with you? Why were you not organized when you took pictures of this? Like, I want to scold 3 years ago, Stephanie, for not doing a good job with this, but you know. So this is Baltimore Album Quilt, multiple makers, 1852, made for Reverend Arthur John Rich. His birth and death dates are 1824 to 1893. Reisterstown, Maryland. Y'all, I live in Reisterstown. It's a tiny town northwest of Baltimore City. And the Maryland Center for History and Culture owns this. And what they say is various biblical passages and hopeful messages embellish this quilt that commemorated Reverend Arthur John Rich's placement as the head and chaplain of the Hannah More Academy in Reisterstown, which I can walk to. It's pretty close to my house. The quilt squares are machine stitched in an arrangement that is atypical for Baltimore album quilts, suggesting that someone sewed them together well after their initial creation. Such efforts highlight the admiration that Baltimore album quilts and their makers' artistry garnered throughout the 19th century. And then his quote about just in general that they've pulled says, assembling the quilt blocks was made the occasion of an album party, and the donors met to present the blocks one at a time. Presumably, the occasion was given over to admiring the blocks, suggesting their arrangements as a whole, and to light talk and refreshments. And so that's a quote from his book. He definitely reached out to a lot of people to find out about, quilting bees and, these album parties. He wanted to know, like, is this a thing that quilters were really doing? Because, he wasn't sure. He was trying to do his research and do it well, right? Hey, Kenny! I saw 2 pictures of Kenny this weekend. One was I guess a Facebook from a week ago or so, where Kenny had lots of hair, and I loved it. Then I saw the other picture of you. He shaved it all off, so it sounds like it got to that point. Okay, so and unfortunately, the Maryland Center for History and Culture takes good care of their stuff, so nothing has good lighting. I'm grateful that they take such good care of these textiles, but they are so hard to take pictures of because there's no like really great lighting on them. I was also taking pictures with a much older phone than I have now. Okay, there's going to be more details of this quilt in a little bit. Okay, so what you see here, this is the invitation to his little quilt exhibit, where he asked just a handful of doctors and nurses, did they have any quilts, family quilts, and would somebody, would they be okay with bringing them in? He's thinking he's going to get like 10 quilts to show off. He got 50, give or take. And so this is the little invitation, and this was most likely made and printed by a patient. This was the idea of occupational therapy, that operating a printing press and making paper art and scrapbooking and all this kind of stuff, his patients did for him or with him because he found it therapeutic for them. And that's so cool. I mean, of course, Dutton knew way back then what we are really just cementing in our minds today. That needlework and doing things with your hands, and I would include in there any kind of craft. And when I say craft, I'm not talking about art versus craft. I'm talking about, craft as a heritage type thing, a thing you make with your hands and it's useful, but it's still art, So woodworking, all of the textile arts, weaving, quilting, needlepoint and stitching. um, basketry, jewelry making, and metalwork. Like these were all things that he was a proponent of. Quilting just like really, you know, n- enlivened his heart. It spoke to him. So Kenny, you crack me up. You look like a dandelion. I get it, but my son and my husband both have very curly hair, and they struggle. Oh yeah. I'm very interested in paper and ephemera conservation, or I mean, I guess conservation you wouldn't necessarily want to like restore, but yeah, I would be interested if you find any info, let me know and I will do the same, because I've got a few pieces of like some old photos and things that in fact my mother asked me to take some quick scans of some pictures that my grandmother had put this album together years ago, and it's one of those awful ones with like the plastic sheet that peels up and the page underneath is covered in like beeswax, and you put the pictures down and you try to pull them off and they're just, yeah, glues and solvents and whatnots from way back. Yeah, the paper disintegrating. You could probably find some like a modern version of the paper and stuff. And Dutton made his own scrapbooks. Like Dutton was like, I'm not going to the stationery store. I'm gonna get my patients and we're gonna make some scrapbooks. And he says that. He says that in letters. I make my own scrapbooks. So, okay. And then these are the pictures from that show. And I've been in this room. This is at Shepherd Pratt. It's the old entrance of Shepherd Pratt. I think, I'm pretty sure, this is, it's now a museum. It's a little museum now at Shepherd Pratt, which is a psychiatric hospital, where Dutton worked, and it's still going strong today in, Quaker foundations, etc. What do we have here? Okay, this is the information about the exhibit. So, the invitation, William Rush Dutton Jr.'s quilt exhibition at Shepherd and Enoch Pratt Hospital, facsimile 1916. So I have touched the real thing. This looks like they probably did like high quality like photography of the stuff to put in this exhibit. But it's at the Baltimore Museum of Art. So in September 1916, Dutton opened a week-long quilt exhibition at the Shepherd and Enoch Pratt Hospital, known as Shepherd Asylum, from 1891 to 1896, where he worked as the assistant physician from 1890, was it 1895 to 1924. Renowned as the birthplace of modern occupational therapy, not really. Dutton brought occupational therapy to Shepherd Pratt. There are multiple other institutions that were utilizing occupational therapy, like particularly up in New York and Massachusetts. They all came together, these doctors, to solidify and professionalize occupational therapy. So I think there's a little bit of probably Dutton's ego is what is fueling some of this, like as the founder, as the So Shepherd and Enoch Pratt Hospital provided patients with innovative treatments and instituted the first occupational therapy courses for young doctors and nurses, which is true. Holding this quilt exhibition perfectly combined Dutton's two passions, the Baltimore album quilts he admired, and the therapeutic benefits from the quilting process itself. Now, I would say, I don't know that there were that many Baltimore album quilts in this exhibit. Just go to Michael's for supplies. Well, come on, Kenny. You don't want to go like make your own paper and stuff? Like what? I'm sure you could find probably something that would be a nice facsimile for your mom's scrapbook. But yeah, just looking in here, I'm zooming in. We see some, the pine tree of life. We see some, I don't know, some diagonal going on. This almost seems like butterflies or something to me. I don't know what this is. This is not a Baltimore album quilt. Like, the way that the setting is. This is a wig rose. Um, these are not Baltimore Album quilts. I kind of almost doubt there's any Baltimore Album quilts in this exhibit. Although he did have like upwards of 50 quilts, so it's entirely possible. Carolina Lily, um, Carolina Lily, some type of wreath. So I think it's a little bit of fantasy going on here. I'm not trying to like trash talk the museum or anything, but okay, this back here might qualify, although I also think this is not a Baltimore album either. Um, some of these might, but yeah, I would say by and large, there really weren't Baltimore album quilts at this exhibit. Again, because they're not that plentiful. I don't want to say that like, oh, there's only 5 in the whole world. Certainly, there's tons of them, but the ones that were made in Baltimore and would have been available to him in 1916, probably not that many. You beg the question, if you study Baltimore album quilts, there's the high style ones, and then there's kind of the knockoffs, I would say, the ones where people were like, ooh, that's cool, I want to make that. Or, as we sort of stretch out into the states that surround Maryland, and, some of this, the inspiration travels. So, again, this is just where I'm coming from. And so, um, ah, an Irish chain, but instead of the center square, do a circle and a square the center. Huh. Yeah. Like this is what you're talking about, right? Irish chain here. This is a single Irish chain. I've taken an Irish chain class, and I learned a very cool technique for like, it was kind of like a speed chain piecing to make an Irish chain. And I don't remember how it was done. Wondering if I have the directions. All right. Moving right along. Okay, I read that to you. Okay, this is the scrapbook. The Maryland Center for History and Culture actually owns this scrapbook. He donated it directly to them, whereas his other scrapbooks about quilting went to the Baltimore Museum of Art. This one is specifically about the Harlem Lodge sanitarium where he worked after he left Shepherd Pratt. But this is an example of like the kind of things his patients did. And I want to say this is one of the occupational therapists that drew these little things. And I did go and examine the scrapbook myself. And who they're talking about here are, they're talking about his sons here. Bill is one of his sons, and Henry is his other son. Henry is the photographer. I'm not sure who this is intended to be, but my guess is it might be his wife. And then this is him, of course. Why We Go Insane is the book he's reading. It's so funny. Anyway, this is just an example of like the kind of relationship that he had with his nurses and occupational therapists, and his family came in as employees into the sanitarium. So he mentions in Occupational Therapy, A Manual for Nurses was a book that he wrote. Like he literally did write the book. I may disagree with him being the father of, but he definitely wrote the book. But he says, we can frequently best help our patient by training the attention. This can most easily be done by arousing his interest in something. And this goes back to the idea of, there was like a credo for occupational therapy, and it's basically like every person should have an occupation, doing something, not just sitting around being ill. If mentally ill, I mean, like, obviously if your body doesn't work, you can't work. But if mentally ill people suffering from, depression and anxiety and, things that I guess don't take them out of the reality of the world, because he also studied schizophrenics, and that's a whole separate situation. But for the women that really struggled with, these nervous complaints, depression and anxiety. Um, he felt that everybody should have an occupation, and even more so, you should have hobbies if your occupation is boring. Like if your occupation is not something you enjoy and you're just doing it to make money, why then you need a hobby. And everybody should have two hobbies, one indoor and one outdoor. And for Dunton, I would say the indoor hobby was studying quilts and his outdoor hobby was fishing. um, so yeah. An interesting thing is, Harlem Lodge used to be, it was called Gundry Sanitarium. It was run by Richard Gundry before Dunton took over. And before Dunton, the sanitarium admitted people with drug and alcohol addiction issues as well. Dunton strongly felt that people with, alcoholics need to be separated from those with, mental illness. The problem I find there is, I mean, we know today mental illness and alcoholism and drug addiction are often comorbidities. Like it's hard to tease them apart. So a person suffering, alcoholism or drug addiction, probably also has anxiety and depression, or some other illness. So, I don't know that all of his ideas were necessarily perfect. Okay. Now we're back to the quilt we were looking at earlier, or no, this isn't it. This is the next quilt on the wall. I'm sorry. These are the details. I'm going to jump forward. This is the quilt that we're going to look at next. This is gorgeous. Now it is the type of chintz I do not like. I don't love this kind of chintz. It doesn't, I don't know. It just doesn't do anything for me. However, I am at the point where I get, much like Dunton before he died, came to appreciate crazy quilts. Some of them were okay. He even bought one. He had one. But I can appreciate the work that went into this and the fact that, in looking at how the maker handled the construction of this quilt and the actual stitching, it's broderie purse. As you guys probably know, it's so all of these elements are cut out of another piece of fabric and they are rearranged into these blocks. And I think that they did a really, really fantastic job in this quilt. And I also have to mention that these, the sashing would have been a border print of the fabric, and they cut it in such a way and kind of done this over under look. Right? Look at the junctions here. It looks like it's woven and, you don't notice that at first, but once you do, you're like, hey, they really thought this out. There is nothing like slapped together about this. They really thought this out. So let's go back here and look at some of these details. So this is one of those quilts. And again, not being an absolute lover of chintz, this is one of these quilts where the needlework on the broderie purse is so good. You cannot distinguish it from a printed fabric. Like, if you didn't know what you were looking at, you would think that these blocks were printed with these designs, right? And they weren't. This is something that has been cut out and so very carefully embroidered down that you can't even tell. I mean, even getting in here so close, you really, really have to look here. And obviously in person, it's a little bit more obvious when you've got your eyeball right up there. But, this is just, it's seamless almost. Sometimes we'll see these and they're, maybe the person wasn't, super great with their cutting or super great with their turning all of those itty bitty little edges under, and you can see like the margin, and you could tell the margin is a different color than the backing fabric. But these quilters were just so exacting with this, with this applique. And the quilting itself is also very lovely, but I just, just look at this. Right? Robin likes the sashing. Yeah, I think, and that's kind of a cool thing also about I've gone to a number of lectures now about chintz. I know a lot more about chintz than I did at this time. It doesn't make me love it anymore, but and when I say I don't love it, I say I would not save my money to buy a chintz quilt. I wouldn't want, I would not hang one prominently in my house just because I don't want to look at it all the time. It's just, it doesn't do anything for me, like my the things I like to look at. But that doesn't mean I don't think these quilts are fantastic because of, how they're constructed. I think it's just amazing. And what they're, the raw material that they were working with, the Baltimore album quilts, this is just one like subsection of that. But there are so many other types of chintz slash broderie purse that quilters and, women were working with, and just the really amazing things they did with it. So here it is again. And then this is the next one. But let me go back to this and read you guys what they say about this. Because I think it's a pretty good overview. Okay, that's not that one. Okay. So this chintz applique album quilt, this is attributed to Joanna Penelope Elizabeth Cushing Montell. What a name. I realized when they put together people's names, obviously, like the women, it's got their married name, their maiden name, married name, but so many of these people have like two middle names, and I'm assuming it's, it's religious, religious purposes, but it's just interesting to me, these long names. Okay. So attributed to her, they have her birth date as 1784 and this quilt as 1834. It was made for Sarah Ann Bartow, whose dates are 1815 to 1892, in Baltimore, Maryland. So they say the Baltimore album quilt tradition did not arise overnight. Joanna Cushing Montell's chintz quilt, made for her daughter-in-law, Sarah Ann Bartow. I'm sorry, did I say Barstow? It's a Bartow. Made for her daughter-in-law, visually documents a transitional style. So this is something when you see exhibits of Baltimore album quilts, you often see this type of these chintz quilts because they're kind of like the predecessor. All the thing, they were using the chintz and fussy cutting, and then they went, you know what? I don't quite like the way the chintz was printed. I'm going to make my own, right? So I think that they consider these to be this transition, and particularly when you look at stuff like this floral, arrangement in an urn, something we often see, and then wreaths of flowers. You can kind of see the step from going from that to Baltimore album quilts. By the 1830s, imported chintz fabrics, which were painted or printed cottons that often featured floral motifs, became more readily available. Women methodically cut pictures from these textiles and appliqued them onto quilts, a process involving sewing pieces of fabric to a larger textile, as demonstrated by the various floral arrangements sewn into Montell's quilt. In the late 19th century, quilters coined this style as broderie purse. So I don't really know exactly when and where that terminology came into play. So yeah, I mean, it obviously there must be some place that has been identified as like that's the first time broderie purse was used as a terminology. But Montell also incorporated elements that epitomize the Baltimore album quilt tradition, symmetrically arranged blocks and names inscribed within these squares. Viewing both autograph books and early album quilts reveals the thread that binds these two trends together. Elegant floral designs and scriptures or names penned by friends and loved ones embellish the books and quilts alike. So, Robin, talk about getting tongue-tied when using their full name while scolding them. Right? Joanna Penelope Elizabeth! I mean, Penelope and Elizabeth are kind of long names. Growing up, Stephanie is a long name. My birth middle name is Lee, Lee. My mom went super short. Okay. All right, so this was the next one. And this is like, we're starting to solidly get into Baltimore album quilts here. Now this one has signatures. So this is Mary M. Marshall is what I see. Obviously these fancy M's. And look at this little, just this little sprig here. And this is some of the stuff my mom was teaching, that, you know, and how the pens, you know, the pens that you use to do this with. Now at this time, and this is interesting. So here's something to talk about. Not part of the show, but what I can say about this, what I've learned. India ink is typically a permanent, light fast, archival ink. Now, when here in the U.S., you know, in days of yore, they made inks from other things. So, like walnut ink is made from the galls of the walnut, whatever, the tree. And then there's other. It's something that's got like metal salts in it. I think that is another type of ink. These inks are bad. These inks are the ones that will deteriorate the fabric. So walnut ink has tannins in it, which stain, bleed, can like deteriorate. And anything with those metal salts just chews right through. India ink, on the other hand, is stable, light, fast, etc. So we've always had permanent ink. And I think generally when you look at ones like this that have, you know, they've survived, they're pretty clear. They look, you know, aside from the fact this quilt is old, they pretty much look like they probably did when the person, you know, wrote the name. Now, and to just quickly say on that, the names are not always written by the person. So this may or may not be Mary M. Marshall's handwriting. This could be somebody, like, you know, there were people involved in the making of this quilt, but one of them had good handwriting. So that person is the one that might ink the names. Lots of quilts that I've seen, you know, particularly in the Pennsylvania Dutch region, Amish Mennonites. You guys might be familiar with the art of the Pennsylvania Dutch. Frockter is one type of artwork. And I mean, that's a whole nother ball of wax there, but it's that German black letter, kind of like the way the letters look. It's not the script. It's this kind of blocky, like very calligraphy like. There were these Frockter artists, and they were men typically. I don't know that I've ever seen anything about a female Frockter artist. I'm assuming they didn't exist. There was all men that did this. But there are quilts out of Pennsylvania where it was very clear, and in fact, it's documented. They know who the Frockter artist was that did some of them, because he had this like little kind of stylized thing that he always did. So they know it's his work. But he would be given the names, and I'm assuming like, you know, pieces of fabric, or maybe they gave him the whole block. I don't know. I mean, I would assume a good artist could just take the block. I personally would never write on a finished block, like, you know, that I'd spend a lot of time on, because you can mess up, right? And they didn't have disappearing ink pens and stuff to like sketch it out. So, you know, it's kind of like a one and done. You mess it up, you got to start over. So anyway, often it's the signature. There's a difference between a name and a signature. You can't always attribute the name as a signature, is the point I'm making. So back to the ink. So India ink has always been available, but not everybody was using India ink to mark their quilts. Ergo, you get quilts that have deterioration. And oh, sorry, my software just did a weird thing. So about 1830s, so a little before this, and Dunton did this research. He was trying to figure out, when did permanent ink become available? The real question is that he should have been asking was, when did permanent ink become marketed? Because India ink has always been permanent, but the marketing of a product And so there's this particular ink company, I think it was Payson's, Payson. He corresponded with them, and he had examples of their marketing materials. And so he was pointing to those dates, the date that they kind of came onto the market as the date when you could kind of connect a lot of this, signing on quilts. The thing is, though, I think that within quilt study, there's a lot of argument about this. They'll say, well, you can't tie this, what you're looking at here, to permanent ink because we've always had permanent ink. Yes, but, or yes, and it was the marketing. Think about stuff today. We've always had certain things, but then they suddenly become popular because of marketing. So yes, people have been marking on fabric in some way, shape, or form. Probably, there's lots of examples of, marking prior to Payson's. Although I would say you're more often going to find little tiny cross stitches. If somebody needed to add like a laundry mark or even, a little name in a quilt, you're going to find little cross stitches, little stitches. Whereas with the ink, really seeing that in this time period where there's this marketing going on, it's like people probably did it before, but it skyrockets. And by the 1840s, when Baltimore album quilts are popular and these other types of album quilts, friendship quilts are starting to, this is what we're seeing, right? This is about marketing. This is not about like discovery or availability. It's marketing. And I think that's why we just see this explosion, because people went, oh, I can write on my quilt. This ink is special and good, etc. Right? Okay. Ooh, Druid has intel. Okay. So Frockter. Frockter quilting commonly refers to two distinct styles. Okay. Okay, inspired by Pennsylvania German folk art. Okay. So it's the Frockter, the writing. It's not actually the quilt specifically. If you guys, so Frockter is Druid spelled it correctly here. It's Fraktur. If you just the Frockter writing is what you want to look for. And then you can probably then find quilts that would use that writing. So Payson's, yes. Payson's indelible ink is a historic fabric marking ink invented by John Payson Williston in the 1830s, widely used for marking linens and military gear in the 19th century. The indelible ink, often sold with a small brush in yellow and red packaging, was popular during the Civil War. Yes. So, again, it is not about the fact that there was the product. It's the fact that a company marketed this product, and that's where you see this explosion. And I mean, in wartime, certainly that makes sense that, you're away from home, you might want to mark your stuff, your gear, your things that belong to you. Yeah. Let's see. So in this other one you said, so quilts inspired by the 18th to 19th century Pennsylvania German folk art, often featuring birds, florals, and calligraphy style applique. So it's what they're really referring to. It's that black letter kind of. And I have pictures of a particular quilt. I'd have to get permission, and I don't know that I could obtain permission because it belongs to a museum that is not real keen on their pictures getting out like on the internet. So maybe I could reproduce one. You guys could kind of get the gist of it. All right, so let's look for more. Oh, this. Look at this, you guys. This silk cornucopia. Look at this thing. And the strawberries. This is all stuffed applique. Okay, Druid has more. Frockter continued to be used to write and print German until January 1941. When use of Frockter in public offices was forbidden as it was declared to be Judenlettern. I'm probably not pronouncing that right, but Jewish letters. Yeah, I mean, that's probably a good point. But I would say, now in present times, when you see this font, like let's call it a font, um, it's very close to like that German black letter. Like this is terrible, but I think about um, Motorhead or AC/DC. I feel like there's some of the heavy metal bands, like they are the hair bands from the 80s. Like sometimes they would have that like badass looking fonts in their stuff. And that like German black letter, I feel like is what they always used. Um, so yeah, I did not realize that used to write and print German. There's German language newspapers that you'll see in this southeastern part of Pennsylvania. You'll see them like in the you can find them in the antique stores, and you can find them online, and they are written like, yeah, they're written with that font, and it's kind of hard to read, honestly, if you're not used to looking at it. I'll have to see if I'll have to dig up some examples next time so that you guys can see with a little more context. So stuffed applique, not trapunto, by the way. Trapunto is stuffing in the quilt itself, in the quilting. When it's the pieces like this that are stuffed, it's called stuffed applique. I've made the mistake myself, so that's simply why I pass on the information. Okay. Close up of those strawberries. Okay, here's another signature. I really wanted to focus on the signatures, and I spent a lot of time talking about Dunton. My boyfriend Dunton. Now this one's faded a bit, and it's just, it may not have been great, super dark writing in the first place, but look at these little flowers and just these little tiny bits, and just so charming and so tiny. Now, I have heard probably maybe in the past year when people talked about this, we could picture in our mind people in the 1800s using those dip pens with the metal nib. If you're an antique collector or you go to antique stores, you've seen these things before. But apparently, supposedly, allegedly, this type of writing was actually not done with a metal nib pen, because get yourself a tiny pointy like marker, like a Pigma pen or a Copic marker, like a really tiny pointy marker, and try to write on fabric, particularly if it's not stabilized, like stuck down to write on it. The nib, the pointiness gets stuck in the fibers, and it'll like literally catch on the fibers, and you'll your line will jump. So supposedly they were using some type of quill, some type of bird quill. I mean, goose quills, I think, were very common, turkey feathers. And it's a very specific quill. I think it's like their flight, their wings, from their wings, I think. But the quills, when they're cut, they're cut at an angle. They can be cut down to be very, very sharply pointed. They're also very soft and flexible. And there's a capillary action in the I guess it's keratin or something, like whatever the end of a pen is, or the end of a feather is made of. I mean, we've all seen feathers, right? Whatever that kind of hard part that grows out of the bird. I think it's probably keratin. That is like the stuff our fingernails are made out of. But there's a capillary action in that material, and so when it's cut and cut to this teeny tiny point, supposedly they could glide over the fabric better. Now, I have not like read anything specific. I've only heard people talk about this, so I don't know, where the knowledge comes from, how accurate it is. It would make sense to me just now, having worked with my mom on her on her project and my own writing on quilts. So I don't know. It's interesting, and I kind of want to like gather up some feathers. Gather up some feathers and like do some tests with this, because I'm very curious. And the other thing is the Froctor. Now I know metal nibs on like ink pens. Of course, they made those like with a flat tip, like a wide flat tip, like for calligraphy. But I think also the quill can be cut like that. So it would make sense to me that possibly the Proctor artist would have used that too. Um, Now, the Proctor signature's much more rare than what you're looking at here. So, I don't know as much about that. Oh, look at this, you guys. Look at this beauty. So lovely. All right. I want to get to the reading. So let me jump forward. See if I can. Okay. So this is that quilt that was at the beginning. This had some really interesting stuff in it. So this was the very first quilt that I went to after the case of the scraps, the bits and pieces. So this is very cute, this nautical sort of theme. Maryland being in Baltimore, particularly being on like coastal, we had, so back in the day, our situation was a little bit different from, say, New England, because New England, have like ports right there on, the Atlantic. In Baltimore, the ports are a little bit different because they have to, like, the ships have to come into the Chesapeake Bay. So, I think that, well, there was lots of commerce coming through. I don't know, we don't have like necessarily as much of this, like we did have whaling. In Baltimore, it was literally about goods coming in. There was not other type, like fishing and whaling wasn't exactly the same here. We didn't have whaling. Fishing was something that was happening on the eastern shore. And the closer part, the part of the Chesapeake that's like literally up against the city, or the city is on the shores of the Chesapeake Bay. I don't know what the fishing situation was back in the day. I've never researched or read about that, but I do know that like the history of the watermen of Maryland, they're out more towards the eastern shore, because we kind of have this, like, we have this double shore situation. We've got the shores of the Chesapeake Bay, and then the outer part of our state has the shore, the Atlantic shore. So, there's a lot of like sailory maritime stuff, but it's a little bit different than what you see up in New England. But obviously, this was made with that in mind. I don't know why I took this picture. Other than, I guess, to show how like this has been basted down to some kind of backing later on. I don't think that is original. And they said so, as such in the description. There's some, I don't know what all this is going on here. And this looks like it's painted or that looks to me like painting on fabric. Oh, how I wish I could go back and look at these again. So this one, so 1852, I'm guessing. Somebody's initials, and you can see where this fabric, it doesn't look like this has been washed, because I believe there's some chintz glaze left in some of these pieces, but it's gotten wet. This quilt has gotten wet, because you can see how that bled a little bit, or maybe it's humidity, but it's not in super condition. Okay, here's another one. May your working realities be like your dreams. And I don't know if this, I don't know what this is. Is it COUL? I'm not sure what this, something DeRose. I don't know what this is here. And it's in, quotations. So I don't know, is this a quote of, or, is this from some kind of a publication? I don't know. HMS? I don't know if that's an S, or if that's like, what other letter would that be? An I? I don't know. November 1857, I think, or 1851, one or the other. I can't remember what they had on the placard about this quilt. This one, my mom loved this, and it's really hard to see because it is so very just faded. And I've tried to make out, and I need to put it into Photoshop and do a better, like, a contrast, because you can take color photos, flip them over to black and white. I mean, you can do a lot of this on your phone. Make them black and white and then mess around with the contrast. And you can often bring up details, faded fabric print or like this, faded writing. But basically, this says, let faith teach those how to live and how to die while it I can't make out what this is, but something a short death. I mean, it's basic. I think this is basically like just having faith that how to live a good life, how to die without, I guess, having something like a stain on your soul. I don't know. I think this is just basically about faith in God, about living in and after living, and all that kind of stuff. But I think what is really charming to me is just this little drawing of this church. And I'm really curious to know what church this is. I would assume somebody's done the research. I don't know. It looks a lot like a church that's kind of near me, but I think that church is like end of the 19th century, not contemporary to this. So, but yeah, isn't it charming? And here's the thing about writing on quilts. While these people may very well have started off with just a piece of fabric, they did go right on a completely finished quilt. I at least I hope not. Because like, oh my gosh, big blob of ink, right? Oh, that just makes my heart like stop. But the fact that, with just a pen and ink, now maybe they were looking at a book, maybe they were looking at an illustration and copying it, but these people didn't have light boxes. They didn't have, scotch tape for taping something, copying something and taping it at a window. And, they did not have all of these things that we take for granted today as like, I want to copy something. I'm a terrible artist, but I can go photocopy this cool drawing out of a book and I could put it on a light box and put some fabric over it and trace it. And then it looks like I'm a great artist. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. I just don't say you drew it if you traced it, right? Like, but they didn't have that. And so this is literally a person that can just draw good, right? Like, and could they have used like a straight edge? Did they practice, like all of those things? Of course. But the talent is there, that this person could either look at an actual church or look at an illustration of a church and then recreate it with ink on fabric. I think is pretty dang amazing. And then they have this lovely script. Now the name here looks like, just looking at it, looks like Pansy Nook. I don't think that's what it is. I can't tell what the first letter is, but ANSIE? I mean, to me, pansy makes the most sense, but Fanny, I don't think it's that either because this looks like an S. Anzy, something. And then I can't tell. This kind of looks like an N, and that kind of looks like a K. It's so difficult. And then this is 1852. So I think that other one I said, I wasn't sure if it was 1851 or 1857. I'm guessing it's 1851. So I have to add this to my list of things to figure out. See if we can get a better contrast on that. Here's another great one. This one's 1852. Something blessing. Obviously, this fold in here doesn't help. And of course, I couldn't go and stretch it out. I would have been unceremoniously kicked out of that museum. When I look at this, I mean, to me, I just sit here and go, this almost looks like a stamp, but every time I have said, oh, that's got to be a stamp. And they did make stamps then, not rubber stamps, but like metal type, the kind of metal type that they would have, used to print books and the newspaper, etc. They had that stuff available decoratively, and you could buy something that, would have a space for you to write in or to insert the metal letters. But this one, I'm pretty sure it was hand done. This is not a stamp, but my goodness, how talented this person, you know, um, a something's blessing, a maker's blessing. I don't know. Lovely flower, these lovely little ribbons. It's so awesome. Here's another one. Trust in the Lord and do good. Short and sweet. And then, as a side note, and I realize that's a little blurry because I'm zoomed in so tight here, but look at it's this like really tight buttonhole stitch around these pieces of chintz. So, you'll see, some broderie purse or appliques you'll see are like a needle turn like that we're familiar with, particularly in that one chintz album quilt. More often than not, though, what I have found, I own one that's like this, and then I've looked at some like this. They use this buttonhole stitch, and sometimes the buttonhole stitch is very dense, very tiny, like just microscopic. The one I have, I didn't even realize until I literally had the thing up to my face like this that it was an actual like itty bitty buttonhole stitch. But I'm guessing it's because when they cut these things out, they know that they don't have a whole lot of a seam allowance there. And I think it's probably pretty easy if they're trying to turn something under that, it might fray and pop out. So they're using this buttonhole stitch as like a satin stitch that we would, on our sewing machine, maybe, cut something out of fabric and use like heat and bond and then do a satin stitch around it with their sewing machine. I mean, that's essentially what they were doing, but by hand. And I think this might be the last one. I'll leave this one as the last one, but Eliza Hooper. And isn't this so precious? It's a little book that this person has drawn, whether it's Eliza or not. And then these little branches, these little flowers, they're so very simple. From a distance, this looks like, oh, so elegant. But, once you zoom in, I mean, it's just like little curly cues and like very basic little flowers. But so charming. I kind of would like to, have my own little thing. I've started signing some of my work with a little cake, but I don't know if I'm going to keep doing that. But I would love to have some like little brand like that I would always draw something and then put my name in it. I have to think about that if I was start doing that. All right. So let's get back to me for a moment so I can pull up. I got to go to the eye doctor, you guys. It's been at least 2 years since I've been to the eye doctor, I think. And I'm really struggling to see stuff on my computer screen. Okay. What do we have here? I don't think that Elizabeth has any pictures of signatures. I did not notice any, so I'm just going to put up some interesting looking toile. Okay. I think this is an interesting toile. So let's look at that while we read. And like I said at the top of the stream, when I flipped this book, and I swear it literally was 15 minutes before I started streaming, I flipped this book open to see like, how much, do we have to read today? And I, because I wanted to read today. And this last section in part 4 is called Document Quilts. And it is absolutely 100% all about writing on quilts. So it's just like, the serendipity, right? I think, I don't know if LJ's here today, but I know this weekend LJ said serendipity, right? And I feel like you have to cling to that. You have to grab it while you can when it happens. So as a reminder, what we are reading is American Quilts by Elizabeth Wells Robertson. It was written in 1948. It is turning out to be quite an interesting little book. It looks very thin, but the type is dense. So I think that if this book had been like the spacing and the font had been a little bigger, this would have been a much bigger book. So, all right. So we left off at the end of part 4, and part 4 is, I'm sorry, part 5. My bad, part 5. We left off at pieced quilts and applique quilts. So she's explained essentially what those two things are. And this is the last section in that chapter called Document Quilts. And I don't know if she means like document as a noun, like a quilt that's a document. Because, you know, you guys, I say that all the time. And I've never read this before. Quilts are documents. They are historical documents. Whether it's a quilt that was made yesterday or a quilt that was made 200 years ago, it is a document. And it says something about the person who made it. It says something about the place and time it was made. So I don't know if that's what she's saying, or is she using this as a verb, document? So document quilts. I don't know. I guess we're going to find out. Maybe. Okay. So document quilts. The Circuit Rider quilt, and I know about this quilt. This is a cool one. The Circuit Rider quilt is an interesting one and comes under the heading of applique, also of the album quilts. It was made for the 100-mile circuit in the Western Reserve. It has been said that no matter how stormy the weather, nor how difficult the roads, this dauntless preacher, astride his chestnut mare, carried the message of hope and cheer to his widely scattered country parishioners, gathered together in their crossroad churches. Now, I don't know if she's going to mention some churches here. It's Methodist. The Circuit Riders, I think, were typically Methodist. And I actually have a book about this. It was like kind of one of the first quilt history books I ever bought. And it's about half like how to, but the history section of it I found to be just fascinating. And I bought that like it was probably 10 years ago. So he served not only one community, but 6. He was a man of sound counsel in spiritual and worldly matters. So great was his influence in his wide territory that even today his name is well known and revered in Ohio, and his stories are an important contribution to the folklore of his state. As a sincere expression of, and she doesn't mention him, his name, so I don't even know what his name is. As a sincere expression of their deep appreciation of his remarkable services, 40 women of the United Brethren Church at Miami, Ohio, so Brethren is another religion, made him a quilt and presented it to him in 1862. Each woman made her own block and signed her name to it. Another album quilt is a pink and white example made for the Reverend Andrew Jackson Bigelow, a Methodist minister of Central Michigan. Okay, so I'm guessing Circuit Riders were not just Methodists. I guess Brethren ministers also did circuit riding. There was a Brethren community in Southern Virginia that I didn't know about until recently. And while I don't think I have any relatives that were on the western side of the state of Virginia, it's very interesting to me. And you know, I kind of want to dabble in the research there. I know a couple people that actually have like family history down there and have been researching. So kind of interesting to see what they found. Another album quote is a number of women parishioners each contributed a block. The sunburst was the design for the pieced block, and in each corner, fine writing in India ink. A woman has signed her name and sometimes the name of her husband and daughter. What about sons? Just daughters? Maybe there's probably one person signed, husband and daughter. That's why they're saying that. The album or autograph quilts have often been used in proving signatures. The story goes that one ambitious woman became a member of the DAR after discovering the signature of her ancestor in an old quilt. Okay. Now, if you guys were following along with me and Jill quilt nerding when we read, oh gosh, do I still have it at my desk? I cannot, I'm blanking on the name of it. We read it back before the holidays, I think around the holidays, but it was about the needlework of older women in the U.S. During this time, like antebellum time. And what was really cool is one of the things that the author showed was that there was a situation where a particular quilt or a sampler, it might have been a sampler, was used to prove relationships for the purpose of war widow uh, payment. I don't know what you call that, like the pension, the war widow pension. A woman was able to, and I think it was a sampler because the sampler would have had the genealogy. But the fact that, when I sit here and say it's a document, it is a document because women literally used some of their needlework as like a proof. Today that wouldn't fly, of course. You need your birth certificate and your driver's license or whatever. But back then, this organization, whatever, the war pension, whatever. I have no idea what the people that made this judgment were, but this woman was able to bring a sampler and prove with her needlework that she was who she said she was, and that she was, that she was able to get her, her husband's pension as a war widow. Very cool. Husband to identify and daughter due to possible involvement. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Okay. A very important and interesting document quilt is the Mary Woodman Washington map quilt. I have not heard of this quilt. It is about 7.5 by 8 feet in size. The top consists of 2 strips of linen upon which is printed 7 copies of the original map of the city of Washington, D.C. When Mary Woodman made this quilt, little did she know that one day her quilt would be used as evidence in the controversy as to who made the first map of the city of Washington. In this copperplate quilt, Major Andrew Ellicott, the Pennsylvania Quaker, as a side note, I have done a bunch of research into his relatives. There were other Quaker Ellicott brothers, who came and established a city here in Maryland, Ellicott City. This guy was up in New York. But Major Andrew Ellicott, the Pennsylvania Quaker, drew the plans and mapped the city with the official backing and sanction of George Washington. Also, guess who helped him? Benjamin Banneker, a free Black person from Maryland, not too far away from where I live. The linen is coarse homespun, and the map is printed from a copper plate in a red-brown color. It is believed that only 8 printings were made on the linen, and 7 of these are in the Mary Woodman quilt. This is fascinating. I've never heard this before. From family records, it is found that the printed linen was given to Mary by her father, Captain Samuel Woodman, on her 16th birthday. Captain Woodman was in command of a full-rigged ship trading in America and foreign ports, and while loading his cargo in Philadelphia, he came into possession of the linen with the copperplate printing of the Washington map. A portrait of George Washington is in an oval design in the upper left corner with the legend, "George Washington, President of the United States." This homespun linen was printed 3 years before Stuart painted his famous portrait of the president. I'm not sure what painter that is. I should probably know, but portraits of presidents has not been my focus. In the top right corner appears the crest of the Washington family. It shows 3 stars and 2 horizontal stripes surmounted by an open Bible. Also, the initial W followed by the word sculptor. That's weird. Okay. Under this is the inscription: Plan of the City of Washington in the Territory of Columbia, ceded by the states of Virginia and Maryland to the United States of America, and by them established as the seat of their government after the year MDCCC. So what is that, 19 or 18? What is a D in Roman numerals? Oh my God, you guys. If anybody is close to their keyboard, what year is MDCCC? Is it 17 something? I don't know. So whatever year Maryland or Virginia went, yes, you can have this little chunk and you can call it Washington, D.C. In the lower left corner, etched in old colonial style, is a description under the title of Observations Explanatory of the Plan of the proposed positions of streets and buildings. Printed on the fabric are the words, "The plan is by Mr. Ellicott." Ah, okay. MDCCC is the Roman numeral for the number 1800. Okay. Yeah, okay. So the CCC, oh, okay, D is 500. Okay. So 1500 plus CCC would be 1800. Okay. You know, guys, I took Latin in high school, 3 years of it. I'm lucky that I can remember, like, how to count in Roman numerals from 1 to 10. I'm terrible. Okay. Major Ellicott fought in the Revolutionary War and is one of the 5 Revolutionary soldiers to be buried at the United States Military Academy at West Point. Mary Woodman, born at Southampton, New Hampshire in 1796, made the map quilt from the linen strips in 1814. The family moved in a wagon driven by an ox team to Cornville, Maine, a little town, in 1831. The town is now known as Skowhegan. Of course, this is 1940s, so yeah. Another graph I need, right? Every time I watch a movie and they come up with the Roman numerals at the end, I'm like, dang, why can't they just put the regular date in there? Like, why does Hollywood have to use Roman numerals? So it probably would have a major impact in my life to be able to better read Roman numerals. The quilt was among the household goods they took with them, but for 64 years, it was almost forgotten by its owners. This historically important map quilt is owned by Dr. Ephraim R. Hackett of Chesterville, Maine. It was on display for an entire year in the Library of Congress during the Washington Bicentennial in 1932. So Washington Bicentennial meaning the birth of George Washington. In American literature, it is interesting to note how often in a story of country life mention was made of quilts. Mrs. Wiggs of Cabbage Patch fame said, "Piecing quilts was keeping at peace and doing away with the scraps." Aunt Jane of Kentucky said, "There is a heap of comfort in making quilts, just to sit and sort over the pieces and call to mind this piece or that is the friend or is the dress of a loved friend." Oh my gosh. It makes me all verklempt. Yeah, she makes a really a good and interesting point, let's see, Aunt Jane of Kentucky, was that Harriet Beecher Stowe? No. Nah. I know I have it right here on my bookshelf. It's probably squinched down there. Nah, I won't be able to reach it, but anyway. Yeah, there's multiple references to quilts in historic writing. I'm sure somebody has documented, in terms of like, for a thesis or something or a white paper, where within American literature mentions of quilts come up. I mean, I'm sure Little Women has got to mention quilts, right? I know I've read it. I don't remember what the mention of quilts might have been, but surely, right? Yeah, so this is interesting. I wonder where this quilt is now. So it was on display for an entire year at the Library of Congress in 1932. So 1932, there would have been, could have been pictures taken of it. I'm going to have to put this one on my list because in terms of commemorative quilts, is something that's obviously on my mind this year. I want, the American Quilt Study Group, Quilt Study. This is a new study year. And we do it every 2 years. So you get 2 years to work on your quilt. I have looked at some of the Washington centennial, bicentennial kind of stuff. There's a Washington bicentennial quilt think it is, actually, I have it right here. It is in Sandra Sider's new book. I'm going to switch to me. Okay, so Sandra Sider's new book, if you do not have it yet, it is fantastic. If you're interested in commemorative quilts, so the centennial, bicentennial, all that, and more, get this book. It's fantastic. Jill and I are going to be reading it starting in April. Let's see. So for my study, there's a couple of different quilts I'm interested in studying. And okay, so this one is, this is the George Washington Bicentennial Quilt, stylized hatchets surrounding a silhouetted portrait. Refer to the legend of Washington as a boy chopping down a cherry tree and confessing to the deed, I cannot tell a lie. A total fake and made up story. But this is the quilt. And I do remember Quilt Nerd Mary, I know, showed this quilt. It's Carrie, I think it's a Carrie Hall pattern. Yeah, Carrie Hall. Carrie Hall made it. I don't know that it was actually literally patterned. It's at the Spencer Museum of Art at the University of Kansas, and it was a gift of Carrie Hall. So Carrie Hall made this quilt. There's this one, and it's commemorating Washington. And then there's this one. This one is, this is a centennial quilt. This is the Gertrude Knappenberger quilt. This one, I believe, is at the American Folk Art Museum. So this is the other one I'm thinking about. I think I have a better chance of getting to see this one because I can get up to New York a little easier than I can get to Kansas. And my last quilt I studied, I didn't get to see it in person, and because it's held at the Shelburne. And the Shelburne's not open 365 days of the year. They're only open during like a season because of the weather up there in Vermont. So yeah, now I'm thinking about this other quilt. I will be doing some research, you guys. I will come back with this intel, maybe not next week, but as soon as I can, because this might make up my mind for me. I'm so curious about this. I mean, I'm just picturing a map printed on fabric. I'm trying to, wrap my head around what that looks like. I'm pretty sure she doesn't have it in the book. I'll have to flip through later and see, but very interesting. All right, guys, I think I'm gonna wrap it up there. We will start part 6 of the book, which is quilting. We'll start that at our next get together. Just a reminder, I should have said at the top of the stream, I will not be around on Thursday, and it's actually for something good. I am going to be going up to Delaware to visit the Whittier Museum, and a friend is one of the curators there, and he has said that Jill and I can interview him, or we can plan some hijinks. And the Whittier folks are very open to it. We had kind of said, we understand sometimes museums are like, we don't want social media. We don't like this whole idea of streaming. We don't know about this. The Whittier has been very, very open about it. And, are like, yeah, if this is something you guys do, we would love to talk to you more. So that's what it is. So hopefully I will at the very least have some pictures to show you. So I won't be here Thursday, but I'll be back the following Monday, and maybe by then I can have a line of inquiry on this quilt that she's talked about. So I hope you guys have a wonderful week. Weather in my neck of the woods was so fantastic this weekend. It's a little colder today. I hope things are leveling and evening out for everybody else across the country. Thank you, El Nino, for 80-degree weather and then snow a week later. I think we've all we've got whiplash from trying to figure out, am I wearing a parka or am I wearing a bathing suit today? So I hope by the time we talk again, we're all in spring and it's nice. And it's not 102 or -5. So So have a wonderful week, and I will see you guys soon. Mwah! Bye!
Agency life, right? You work hard every day, juggling demanding client interests.